It's good to see you all again. Thanks very much for coming back to this second session on the Humanae Vitae offered by the Iona Institute NI. If any of you weren't here last week, my name's Dr. Gaven Kerr. You can call me Gavin, it's okay. And so I'm delivering the first three of these talks. This is the second one. Just a bit of housekeeping. Next week, we won't be having a session because the school are going to be having their school play here, okay? So we're skipping a session next week. You'll probably need the rest, okay, after these first two, all right? And then we're coming back the week after, okay? So next week will be, what date is it today? This is so next week will be the 21st. No, next week will be the 14th, sorry. And then the week after will be the 21st is when we come back, okay? So when we come back on the 21st, I'll deliver the third session, and then Tracy will deliver the final session after that, okay? Is that okay? Yes. Yeah, okay, grand. So tonight, what we're going to be looking at is, we looked at the sort of whole historical context of the encyclical last week. We saw where it came from. We saw the different pressures on Pope Paul VI in writing the encyclical and the context of the Church's traditional teaching against contraception. Okay, so we saw all that different mixture which was affecting Pope Paul VI in writing Humanae Vitae. Now we're going to look at the actual reasoning of the encyclical, what Pope Paul VI states in the encyclical. So that's what we're going to get tonight. So this is the meat of the encyclical tonight. We're going to see the reasons why he rejected all forms of artificial contraception, okay, as morally illicit and thus is binding on Catholics not to use them, okay. In the following week, when we come back on the 21st, we're going to look at the whole vision of marriage and the family that informs that. We are going to get into the vision of marriage and the family here as it is in the encyclical, but we're going to look at that deeper background when we come back in the third session. That's the background of John Paul II, of this whole personalist philosophy and this personalist norm, which informs an awful lot of Catholic thinking in moral matters. So you're going to be hearing an awful lot about St. Thomas Aquinas and Boethius and people like that when we come back on the 21st. But this week we're going to be looking at the actual reason of the encyclical, what it is that Pope Paul VI actually states. Okay. He didn't reject all artificial contraception on a whim, and he didn't just think, I'm the Pope, I'm going to reject what the majority opinion of the Commission stated about contraception. He actually gives solid reasoning for the position that he adopts. So if you remember last week, the majority of the Commission set up to explore this issue suggested that the Pope would revise Catholic teaching in some sort of way and allow Catholics to use contraception. And we also saw that the principle of totality was an important principle working in a lot of different Catholic circles. This is a principle in moral theology, that so long as the majority of one's acts are licit within a marriage, okay, so as long as the majority of the marital acts within a marriage are okay, then in other circumstances, it's okay to use contraception, so long as the marriage as a whole is not one which is completely contraceptive. That was the principle of totality. Pope Paul VI refers to that in Humanae Vitae, and he answers that particular issue, and he also refers to the majority opinion of the Commission. He gives regard to that, but he gives a different vision of what he thinks marriage and the family is within the encyclical. So I'm going to take us through that this evening. So if you get anything out of this, you'll have a nice sort of understanding of the breakdown of the encyclical, if you haven't already read it. Okay, so married love and responsible parenthood. Pope Paul VI notes in the encyclical, right at the beginning of the encyclical, that those people who want to justify artificial contraception, okay, so the various individuals who think artificial contraception is okay and that we should allow some sort of justification for it, they do so because they want to promote married love and responsible parenthood. They want to promote married love because an essential feature of married life is one's sexual expression to one's spouse. That's an essential feature of married love. One cannot be married unless that goes on within a marriage. And so those who wanted to justify contraception said, well, look, in order to allow married love to flourish, we need to allow for artificial contraception. Not to do that would entail that married love is constrained in some sort of way, that husbands and wives can't express themselves physically to each other whenever they need to. They also wanted to promote responsible parenthood. They wanted to say, look, sometimes it is just irresponsible to become parents. We're going to have a look at that later on, situations when it does seem to be irresponsible to become parents, say dire financial situations, dire social situations, or in particular cases where the health of the mother would particularly be endangered by another child, preeclampsia, something like that. Okay? These are serious issues and they're genuine concerns, and the Pope recognises them. And so he begins the encyclical by giving his vision of what married love is and what responsible parenthood is. So he begins by a consideration of the nature of married love and the nature of responsible parenthood. And on the basis of his considerations of those, he comes to a different conclusion than those who would seek a justification of artificial contraception. So he's considering the same motivating factors, but comes to a different conclusion. So he sees the same issues as being serious, but in his own way, for his own reasons, he says, well, look, this just cannot be accommodated by means of artificial contraception. We need to go some other sort of way. So he begins the encyclical by noting that marriage is a sacrament, okay? That's a fundamental teaching of the Catholic faith, that marriage is a sacrament. There is such a thing called natural marriage, okay? And this is when, man and woman come together for a lifelong relationship for the purposes of, bringing about a family. That notion of a natural marriage is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in every human society, that sort of relationship is to be found, okay? Catholicism recognizes that natural marriage as something which is able to lead us to the divine. And that's precisely why Christ institutes it as a sacrament within the Gospels. That relationship between man and woman is something which is expressive of divine love and which is capable of sanctifying the two individuals within that relationship. Okay? It's something which is capable of bringing them closer to God and thus bringing about the sanctity of the two of them. So Pope Paul VI recognizes the sacramental nature of marriage. Okay. Now within that vision of marriage, which is built upon natural marriage, man and woman, the man and the woman, they give themselves to each other as two complementary parts. Okay, so they're complementary to each other. They give themselves to each other, and in their complementarity, they're united. They're made one. Think about that notion of being united, of unity. They become one. The two become one. That has a physical manifestation, which we'll see. In sexual intercourse, the two become one. But it also has a more spiritual manifestation, that the two wills become one with each other. And it's Pope Paul VI's analysis of the wills becoming one with each other which begins his analysis of what married love is. What he's going to argue is that because married love is the unity of these two wills, a willing of the good for each other, it's not based on sentimentality or feeling. It's fully human. It's a rational kind of love where we will the good for each other. We just don't feel good things for each other. We actually want good things for the other. And in doing so, we commit ourselves to each other. He takes that to be a constitutive feature of marriage. And it's something which in contemporary society is quite lost when we think about the nature of married love, because in contemporary discussions of married love, outside of, Catholic moral theology, the notion of love is kind of just, I like you and you like me, and we continue to like each other. We have these very strong feelings and sentiments for each other, and that's enough for married love. The Pope says that married love is something much more deeper than that, that we have to will the good for each other, even when we don't like each other. Okay, so I'm married, and I can tell you that in my situation, there are occasions when I just don't like my wife. Okay, there just are. And I'm sure there are occasions when she doesn't like me. She's pregnant at the minute, so you can edit that out of the video, okay, David? Right? But I still love her because I will the good for her even when I don't like her. There are a lot of times where I really do like her, but there's other times where I don't like her, but I still will the good for her. I'll still give her a lift, I'll make her lunch, I'll make dinner, I'll clean the house, she'll have everything that I own, all of that. Okay, that's the kind of vision of married love that Pope Paul VI is trying to express, and it's one which is lost in contemporary society, because it seems that in contemporary accounts of love, as soon as we stop liking each other, then, well, we don't love each other anymore, so if we don't like each other, we're constantly fighting, well, why don't we just separate and get a divorce? Instead of, realizing that as married and loving each other as married, what we actually want is to will the good of each other as beloved. That's the general attitude here, and we're going to tease through that throughout the encyclical. That's what you get in the encyclical. So, the first thing that the Pope says about married love is that it's human love, okay? It's human beings get married, human persons, as we'll find out in a couple of weeks, they get married. Married love is human love. Marriage is something which unites two humans with each other. As soon as we find other rational individuals which aren't human, okay, then we'll address the issue of whether or not they can be married. But for the moment, it's human beings which are married to each other. And human beings are rational individuals. They're rational substances in a traditional definition. And what that means is that human beings are bodily things. We mentioned Descartes last week. Descartes thought that a human person was just this mind floating about, okay? And if you remember last week, I said that it's all his fault, everything went wrong. Well, the traditional Catholic view is that a human being is a rational substance, a particular kind of substance. We're literally a certain kind of animal, and we're distinct from other animals because of our rationality. Our rationality is an expression of the type of animality that we are. There's a biblical root to that we are just these physical substances because we come from dust. We come from the earth, and God has breathed life into us. And on Ash Wednesday, if any of us are Catholics here, Ash Wednesday, we're reminded of that, that we are dust. Okay, so there is a definite physical part to our nature, but we're these rational kind of substances, okay? And as those kinds of bodily things, rational bodily things, the love that we have has to incorporate both our bodily nature and our rational nature. So our married love for each other has to involve the body, and it does in sexual intercourse, but it has to involve our reason. And that's the unity of wills that the Pope is going to talk about, willing the good for each other. So married love isn't just emotion or sentimentality. It's not just me saying to my wife, I like you and you like me, but what happens when we don't like each other, when we're arguing or bickering or something like that? It has to be that I will the good for my wife because she is my beloved, okay? And I will good things for her, despite the fact that sometimes I don't like her. And it's the same with our children as well. Sometimes your children do things and you're just like, and it drives you up the wall, but you still love them because you want good things for them, okay? So you're willing the good for them because they're the beloved, and that's reciprocal. One spouse wills the good for you because you're their beloved, okay? So what they want is they want all good things for you, and they will give all, and she will give all good things for me. So that's the idea behind it. So it's not just this feeling of sentimentality or whatever, and it's able to overcome feelings of sentimentality. Okay, so married love is a willed act. It's something that you will. It's not just something that you feel, it's something that you do. If married love was just something that you feel, it would be very difficult to promise to love one another for life, because you can't promise to somebody else just to have this feeling of sentiment for life. You can't promise to feel the same thing for the rest of your life, because feelings come and go. They're known as passions. Whereas you can will to love each other in the sense of willing the good for each other for life, despite what passions may come and go throughout your life. That's why you're able to do it for life. We're going to see that in this notion that, of the total self-giving of the spouses to each other later on. So husband and wife are united in marriage, at least spiritually speaking, in the unity of wills, where they both will the good for each other. So their wills become united. They become as one with each other because they will the good for each other. That's the first aspect of married love that the Pope highlights, that it's human and rational and thus involves the willed act. The second aspect is that it's total. So married love is something total. It's not something fleeting. And this is because in married love, you will the good of the other, of the beloved, precisely as other, precisely because they are your beloved. You don't just have a feeling for them, a feeling of, I like you, I like being in your presence, I like being surrounded by you, until I'm not with you, or until you annoy me or do something, then I want to be away from you. It's not having a feeling of pleasure in the presence of your beloved, because if you only love someone because you have this feeling of pleasure around them, then that love isn't about them, it's about me. Okay, so if I only love somebody because I like being around them, then the whole operative question, the whole issue there is, well, look, how can I be pleased? How can you do something to please me? It's all about me and how I can be pleased. It's not about the other who is my beloved. It's not about willing their good. It's about trying to take from them something that pleases me. Okay, the Pope's vision, on the other hand, is that insofar as married love is willing the good for the other, for one's beloved, it's lacking in self-interest. It's completely focused on the other. That's what genuine married love is, according to the Pope. It's not taking from the other what one wants or what one would desire. It's desiring to give everything to the other that the other can have as one's beloved, completely willing to do good for them. And there's something of the divine in that as well. God's love is totally self-giving. That's the nature of God's love. It completely pours out from itself. That goes right back to, again, mentioning Plato, the Neoplatonists in ancient philosophy. They held that because God is pure goodness, because the one is pure goodness itself, if it were not to express its goodness to other, it wouldn't be pure goodness itself. It would be lacking in the good in some sort of way. It is of the nature of the good to spread itself out. Otherwise, it's trying to keep the good for itself and thus lacks in the good in some sort of way. And the Christians readily took that up and integrated that within St. John's theology of God as pure love itself. That God, in being love itself, seeks to diffuse goodness out to everything. And that's the nature of married love. That in married love, we seek the good of the other. Okay, we seek to give the good to the other, give everything of ourselves to the other. And here's a wee quote from Pope Paul VI. Whoever really loves his partner loves not only for what he receives, but loves that partner for her own sake, content to be able to enrich the other with the gift of himself. Sometimes it sounds a wee bit, proud, I will give you, the gift of myself and you should feel great about this because you have me. That's not the idea. It's that the beloved receives all that is good from you, and you receive everything that is good from her as the beloved. Okay. Now, on the basis of that, the Pope then infers that marriage love is both faithful and exclusive. So when you make the declaration of married love, those of us who are married, we make this declaration in public. There are witnesses. It's made publicly. You pledge yourself to the other. Man and wife pledge themselves to each other in marriage. And then given that this is a willed human act, and it's totally self-giving, it's total. I give everything of myself to my wife, and she gives everything of herself to me. It has to be for life, and it can't be for anyone else. So given that it's a total willed act, I totally will myself to my wife, and she wills herself to me, there's a lifelong commitment there, and it's exclusive, excludes anybody else. The lifelong commitment is there because if you give yourself totally to the other, you're giving yourself to them for as long as they are other, for as long as that person is your beloved. So I give myself to my wife for as long as she is what she is, okay? Until she substantially changes into something else, which only happens at death, she has that gift of me to her for life. So for as long as she is what she is, the other, who is my beloved, I've given myself to her, and reciprocally, she's given herself to me. So there is a lifelong commitment to marriage then, in willing oneself to the other. So we don't just say, look, I'll will to give myself to you for, your own good for maybe 25 years, and then we'll come back and reevaluate that. That's not the commitment we make whenever we will something. That may be the commitment that you'll make when you say, look, I'll be with you so long as I feel good being with you. And then once we stop feeling good being with each other, we'll reevaluate things. That's not a human kind of love. That's not a rational love. That's the more non-human animal kind of love, where you have that sentimentality, feeling, and emotion. In order for human love to be totally self-giving, it has to last as long as the other is there to whom one gave oneself. And that lasts then, human beings last right up until death. And once they die, then there is no other there for you to give yourself to. That's why one can be remarried after death. That's why one can take on another wife after death once one's wife has passed away. The exclusivity then follows from that, because I can't give myself totally to another for, well, her own good in this case. If I'm divided in some sort of way and giving myself to my wife and to this woman and to this woman and to this person here, I can't do that. That can't be a total self-giving. I'm not just willing the good of my wife. I'm willing my wife's good to a certain extent, but I'm also willing these other women goods as well. So there has to be some sort of exclusivity to marriage. Okay, so it has to be to the one person for life. And this is on the basis of the fact that married love is something that we will, not just something that we feel. If married love were just something that we feel, well, you can feel all these same things for this woman and for that woman and for another woman. But because it's something that we will, insofar as we give ourselves to the other, it is something that has to be for life and completely exclusive. Now, this total self-giving for the other, the Pope then states, is productive of life. Okay, this is what it is. It produces life in some sort of way, or it's ordered to the production of life. So when the husband gives himself to the wife, and the wife gives herself to the husband, this is a human self-giving. We've talked an awful lot about willing each other, but the human will isn't an angel's will. We're not immaterial substances, we're material things. So when we will ourselves for the good of each other, we do so as bodily things, okay? And some bodily goods involve sexual intercourse, okay? So husband and wife, in willing the good for each other and seeking to become united with each other, will engage in sexual intercourse. And that's essential to any marriage. That helps constitute the nature of the married relationship. In sexual intercourse, the two become one, so that the spiritual unity of their wills is exhibited in their bodily unity. They have a bodily unity, and they also have a unity of wills, so they're completely united as human beings. They're united in their reason, and they're united in their animality. So the two become completely one. Are we okay with that? Are we following this so far? Good. I see a lot of heads nodding. So, all right. So full and complete human unity then is when these two rational substances, these two persons, come together and are wholly united to each other, body and soul. And then that unity, which is completed by means of sexual intercourse, constitutes the marriage relationship. You can't have a marriage relationship without sexual intercourse. So if sexual intercourse doesn't occur in a marriage, it's questionable whether there's actually a marriage there in place. But what that means then is that given that bodily unity occurs within a marriage and is essential to marriage, marriage unity is ordained or ordered to take on its own physical manifestation in offspring, in reproduction. The function of sexual unity, the primary function of sexual unity is the continuation of the species, and this is the case in all species which reproduce sexually. Human beings are a species that reproduce sexually. So the primary function of sexual intercourse is the continuation of the species, and then there are various other secondary features of it, which we'll get into. And I know a lot of you are sitting thinking, what about infertile couples? Okay, there's a big slide which says infertility ? Coming up. Okay, so we are going to go through that. But the Pope holds then that this fourth and final feature of married love is because it involves both bodily unity and the unity of wills, will involve some sort of procreation, okay, so that it is ordered to the production of offspring. And then in a theological context, offspring are the physical manifestation of the unity of husband and wife. So husband and wife as two individuals come together as a unity for a time, and then that unity produces an actual physical manifestation of their love. Okay, that's a theological or spiritual bond the parents have towards their children. Okay, that's how Pope Paul VI envisages married love. Okay, and it's on the basis of that vision of married love that Pope Paul VI is going to come to a different account or a different answer to these problems that those with a more contraceptive mentality think contraception should be justified. So as we saw, there were these various motivations from various quarters who held that, look, in order to preserve or to promote married love and in order to promote responsible parenthood, we need to allow for contraception. Well, Pope Paul VI says, okay, well, let's go with that. Let's consider what married love is, and now we'll see whether or not contraception is consistent with that. As we know from the encyclical, he says no. We're going to draw out from the reasons that he's given here why he says no to that. Okay. Beginning with responsible parenthood. Responsible parenthood is something that Pope Paul VI makes a lot of in Humanae Vitae. Part of the legend and the myth of Humanae Vitae is that Catholics deny this whole notion of responsible parenthood, that we just have to become parents just as and when, everything suits us. The Pope is going to argue that if married love is human love and is thus rational, it has to involve some sort of responsibility. That is what it means to be human and rational with regard to our actions. We take responsibility for our actions. Whenever we will something, we take some sort of responsibility for it. So one can be accused of being responsible or irresponsible, acting in a morally virtuous way or in a morally vicious way. So every action that we undertake as humans, that we will to undertake, has some sort of moral content to it and can be evaluated accordingly. And the Pope is completely aware of that, and the Pope talks an awful lot about responsible parenthood in the encyclical. So reproduction, and thus parenthood, is an effect of married love. It's an effect of the unity that the spouses have when they come to each other. It's an effect of the unitive nature of their love. So the ultimate, or what we would say the primary goal of married love is reproduction. Its immediate goal, its non-primary or more immediate goal, might be multivarious in many reasons. So there's lots of different reasons why a married couple may choose to have sexual intercourse on any one occasion. They may not even be thinking about reproduction, but that doesn't mean that the purpose or nature of the reproductive act isn't reproduction. Okay, so this is what's known in philosophy as the finality or the end of a particular action. An action can have a particular end or goal which you may not even intend for it. You could be doing a particular action whose very nature is for some sort of end, but you may not even intend it. So for instance, you could run to work or you could cycle to work every day. Now what you're actually thinking and consciously intending to do is to get to work. You may not consciously or intentionally be acting to get fitter, but the very end or the purpose or the nature of running is that the body will get fitter. So the ultimate end of your running to work every day is that you get fitter and healthier and all sorts, but you may not even have been actually thinking about that by, say, taking your bike to work every day just to beat the traffic. The same goes here, that the ultimate aim or the ultimate purpose of sexual intercourse is reproduction. But when you engage in it, just like taking your bike to work, you may not be thinking about that at all. You may be having sexual intercourse for some other reason, completely unrelated to reproduction, but that's what the finality or the end of sexual intercourse is. And that's an important distinction to make, because a lot of people will say that, when depicting the Catholic view of the matter, will say that, Catholics think that you should only have sexual intercourse so long as you want to have children. You have to want to have children every time you have sexual intercourse. But that's not the case. It's more of a negative sort of restriction, that so long as the sexual intercourse is open to having children, you can want all sorts of things out of sexual intercourse, but so long as it isn't constrained through contraception, as we'll see from the encyclical, it's okay to want all various sorts of things out of sexual intercourse. Now, insofar as the married love is human, the two human beings have, it has to be subject to reason in some sort of way. If the married love isn't subject to reason, it's not human love. Humans are reasonable, rational things, and if they don't subject their actions to reason, they're acting like non-human things. They're acting in an irrational manner. They're acting like some non-human animal. So it can't just be based on sentiment, emotion, or feeling, or whatever. So there has to be some sort of responsibility which comes from married love. And because this love strives after procreation, that responsibility has to be concerned with procreation in some sort of way. So one has to exercise one's married love in a rational and reasonable manner, and that brings in a need for responsible parenthood. Spouses have to talk about that. Spouses have to take that into consideration as rational kind of things. If we're not rational things, then if we just work off the basis of sentiment, emotion, instinct, then we can have sexual intercourse whenever the mood or the season takes us. But precisely because we are rational, we have to subject that to our reason and reason it through and think what would be the responsible thing to do within this situation. So responsible parenthood, far from being ignored in Catholic moral theology or in the thought of Paul VI, is actually mandated by Paul VI's thinking on married love. His very vision of married love requires parenthood to be responsible because it's a feature of human reason. Now, when we think about responsible parenthood, as a feature of human reason, this has to be sensitive to the goods of the spouses involved. So the husband and wife, in thinking of responsible parenthood, have to think in terms of what are the goods of, say, my husband and what is the good of my wife in this particular case. Often, the goods involved with the individual spouse is the good of the mother in some sort of way when we're thinking about responsible parenthood, because pregnancy is a real burden on the mother. It's a serious burden. Not just biologically and physically, but also mentally as well. And then it becomes a burden within sort of the family circle as husband and wife, how they deal with a pregnancy. And then it becomes a burden in a wider societal sort of way, poverty, the particular social situation and all that. The Pope states in the encyclical that if there are serious reasons and due respect is shown to the natural law, one can use legitimate means to limit one's family size. We're going to see what legitimate means are after we consider contraception, but he states that one can use legitimate means to limit one's family size, and that will be practicing responsible parenthood. Now, the serious reasons that trigger responsible parenthood are twofold. They come under two categories. The first pertains to the health of the individual involved, generally the mother, and the second refers to social circumstances. So these are the serious reasons, and they fall under these two heads. We consider the health, first of all, of the individuals, and then we consider the social circumstances. Considering the individual's health, generally this triggers responsible parenthood if pregnancy and childbirth were to be a threat to the mother's health. In the most serious case, if they were to be life-threatening. So somebody with a history of preeclampsia or somebody like that is told that if you get pregnant again, you will likely die. Okay, and I do have a friend that was told this. Okay, so these are real cases. These things do happen. It would be irresponsible in situations like that where there is this serious threat to the mother's health to become pregnant in those circumstances. Exercising responsibility would be to use legitimate means not to become pregnant. And as I say, we're going to consider the legitimate means later. But at least the Pope's saying here that in situations like that, we do have to think about using legitimate means to become pregnant, and that's or not to become pregnant. And that's a conversation that the husband and wife need to have for themselves. Quite clearly in life or death scenarios, that's something which is very clear, and you can almost have completely objective guidelines for that, that if the mother is likely to die, really it just would be irresponsible to get pregnant here. But then there are other sorts of scenarios as well where the mother's health could take quite a hammering. She could have all sorts of health conditions for the rest of her life. I've heard and seen situations where some women have lost their hearing as a result of pregnancy. That could be something that triggers responsible parenthood. And then there's various mental health features as well. Sometimes as a result of postnatal depression, traumatic delivery, the mother just cannot deal with another pregnancy at that time, in which case, an argument could be made that responsible parenthood would be triggered there as well. These are all sorts of situations that range from the very serious to the not so serious, and that's something that the spouses have to discuss amongst themselves as rational individuals to think about whether or not it would be a good and responsible thing to allow for pregnancy in this situation. The second category then are social circumstances. And the social circumstances which would trigger responsible parenthood are if pregnancy were to endanger the family in some sort of way, whether to endanger the two spouses or to endanger the wider family if it's a second, third or fourth pregnancy. One example that was given, I don't know how relevant it is now, is the example of forced abortions in China, okay, where it might be the case that given that after the first child, if one were to become pregnant with a second or third child, one would feel the heavy hand of the state, okay, in some sort of persecution from the state by means of forced abortions or other measures. It would be responsible not to seek out pregnancy in those situations or to take legitimate means not to get pregnant. Another classic example is poverty. As memory serves me, Pope Paul VI does talk about economic considerations as reasons for limiting family size. There's an argument there, there's a discussion there, what sort of poverty would trigger responsible parenthood here? Homelessness and starvation definitely is something that would trigger responsible parenthood. That if you are homeless and if you are starving, it would be difficult to see why it would be responsible to allow for another pregnancy in that situation. But the less sort of serious sort of poverty, poorness, just the sort of poverty that many would have in the Western world, which isn't really homelessness and starvation, but is more of a lack of complete control over social means and a dependency on others, but still quite a high standard of living, with a roof over your head and, regular food and that sort of thing. It's, it's arguable that that may not be the sort of, poverty and economic conditions which would trigger responsible parenthood. But that's something for a more deeper sort of social and theological discussion. In any case, the Pope argues, he doesn't stipulate any conditions with the social circumstances, but he does say that there are certain social circumstances that you can think through, and they would trigger this notion of responsible parenthood, that, in some situations it would be irresponsible to get pregnant in those situations. Okay, so Pope Paul VI, he does recognise the principle of responsible parenthood, and it's part and parcel of married love is fully human. If you don't practice responsible parenthood, you're not practicing human love. It's not married love. Any failure to take responsibility for your sexual relations with your spouse is a failure to act in a fully human manner, and therefore it's a failure to act in a reasonable manner. And so we're now at the very crux of the issue. So if we grant the principle of responsible parenthood, can this be achieved by means of artificial contraception? Okay, the Pope and his opponents, they both granted responsible parenthood, but they just thought artificial contraception could do the job. Okay, what does the Pope have to say about that? Okay, can we use barrier methods, sterilization, or the contraceptive pill to practice responsible parenthood? Well, we all know the Pope says no. Okay, the Pope doesn't think you can. He holds that any introduction of artificial contraception into the Marriage Act undermines the unitive function of the Marriage Act and its procreative function. So he holds that artificial contraception undermines both the unity and the procreative nature of the Marriage Act. Effectively, as we'll see, he holds that it transforms the whole nature of the Married Act. It's no longer the Married Act whereby the two give each other to each other completely. It's a different sort of act whereby I try to get what I want from my spouse and she tries to get what she wants from me. So it's not a self-giving of each other to each other. So we're going to deal with each of these in turn. The break in unity and the undermining of the procreative function. The Pope holds that artificial contraception breaks the unity of married love. So now we noted at the beginning that married love is fully human and it's total. Okay, so it's rational in being fully human, and it's a total self-giving of the one to the other. So it involves, say, me as a spouse totally giving myself to my wife as the other, and this is a willed self-giving. I want to do this. I want to give myself to her completely for the rest of her life, even though sometimes I may not like her and may argue with her and whatever. Barrier methods of contraception, okay, those which introduce a barrier there in the sexual act to prevent reproduction, they quite clearly break the unity between man and woman in the sexual act. Remember, the unity of married love involves bodily unity as well. When you put a barrier, literally a barrier between the two bodies, there's no unity that occurs there. There's actually a barrier there stopping unity taking place. There may be unity of wills to a certain extent, but there is not physical unity going on, because what the barrier there is there to do is to disrupt the physical unity. By doing this, the act is literally no longer one of sexual intercourse, but it's an act whose sole function is for the purpose of achieving sexual pleasure. That's what the barrier is there to do. It's to allow you to avoid the natural order of sexual intercourse and to achieve sexual pleasure independently of that natural order. That act of achieving sexual pleasure can be achieved without even having sexual intercourse. That's why whenever you transform the action into something which is just about sexual pleasure, it is no longer an act of sexual intercourse, it's an act of something else. Call it whatever you want. Okay, mutual masturbation, whatever. It's something which is simply ordained to achieving that sort of sexual pleasure. In that case, one is not giving oneself totally to the other for his or her good, but one is restraining oneself. One's holding back and working towards one's own good of sexual pleasure. You're not giving yourself one is not giving oneself totally to one's spouse, but one is trying to get from one's spouse everything one can. So instead of that being a mutually reciprocal relationship where I give to her and she gives to me for my own good and we will the good of each other, I try to take from her and she tries to take from me. It's a very parasitic relationship going on there rather than an enriching relationship going on. As we'll see in the next session, Pope John Paul makes an awful lot out of that situation, that whenever one engages physically with each other, one engages in a kind of a parasitical relationship rather than in a mutually enriching relationship. Now that's just the case of barrier methods. Sterilization and the contraceptive pill, they don't introduce a barrier, and so they don't break the unity of married love, as some would argue. Okay, so they don't introduce this physical barrier between each other, and so they don't disrupt the unity. So what would we say about that? Well, the Pope says that whenever we employ these measures, sterilization or the contraceptive pill, the non-barrier methods, the spouse involved, or the spouses involved, they still do not give themselves fully to each other, because in these cases, just like in the barrier method cases, the act in which they're involved ceases to be one which brings the sexual organs to their natural completion, i.e. sexual intercourse with an opposite sex individual. It's not about following the natural order of the sexual organs, but it's simply an action which seeks to achieve sexual pleasure at any means. And that can be done outside of sexual intercourse. That can be done in lots of different ways. So it's no different from those different ways of achieving sexual pleasure. So it's an action quite distinct from that of normal sexual intercourse. So the act is no longer one, in the cases of sterilization and the contraceptive pill, it's no longer an act which unites the two spouses, but like those actions which use barrier methods, it's one in which each spouse works towards his or own sexual satisfaction. So there isn't that mutual self-giving of one spouse to the other, even in cases of the contraceptive pill and sterilization. That is what the Pope has to say about contraception with regard to the unity that there is in marriage. It disrupts the physical unity and it disrupts the spiritual unity of married love. And they're essential features of married love, as we've seen. But it also, very clearly, disrupts the procreative function of the sexual act. So artificial contraception is designed to remove that procreative function of the sexual act. The procreative function of the sexual act is what the sexual organs do. That's what they're there for. That's what sexual reproduction is. That's why we and a lot of other species have sexual organs, in order for them to be completed in the complementarity of an opposite sex individual. The sexual organs in the body are the only bodily organs that require the organs of another individual for their completion. Every other organ in the human body is self-serving within the body itself, but the sexual organs require some sort of other member of the species in order to complete them. And the function of that is for the continuation of the species. That's the natural end or order of it. But what contraception does is it disrupts that, and it changes that, and it takes what is a healthy, normal functioning organ of the body and changes it into something else and renders it obsolete. So what the Pope is going to argue is that in rendering the procreative function of the marriage act obsolete, by stopping it in its tracks, it betrays the very nature of married love. Because married love is this unity of the two individuals, both in will and in body, which has this physical manifestation in sexual intercourse. By disrupting the very nature of sexual intercourse, you disrupt the very nature of the marriage itself. And it ceases to be this total self-giving of the two to each other and becomes this idea of the one trying to grasp whatever he or she can of the other and make use of the other in the best way that he or she can. So it's a betrayal of the marriage, according to the Pope. But what about infertility? Okay, those who are infertile. If procreation is a necessary feature of the sexual act, that's what the sexual act does, what about those who are infertile? What about infertile people? And we're going to go through this. Is their married love dysfunctional, those who are infertile? And for any of you who participate in the whole issue of same-sex marriage and the nature of same-sex marriage, and those who argue that marriage in the family is for the purposes of raising a family per the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a lot of the reasoning here applies to those same discussions within same-sex marriage. Okay, so it kind of goes back and forth because it's all part and parcel of what the vision for the nature of marriage is. So, is the married love of those who are infertile dysfunctional because, they can't reproduce? Okay, if it's the nature of the sexual act to, lead to procreation, and if one is infertile, then does that mean that their sexual act and thus their marriage act, that there's something wrong with it? We're going to go through this now. So it's the function of the sexual act that is reproductive, so that's what the sexual organs do. But in some cases, there are circumstances which are extrinsic, okay, so note that, extrinsic to the act itself, that may entail that act is not reproductive. Okay, so you have the sexual act itself, and it's of its nature to be reproductive. Okay, if you want to reproduce in the human species, that's what you need to do in order to reproduce. setting science and stuff like that aside, that's typically not normally what you need to do. But there may be certain circumstances which are extrinsic to the very nature of the act itself, which means reproduction doesn't occur. And this is what is the case within fertile couples. Within fertile couples, there's normally, they engage in normal, sexual intercourse, but there are certain circumstances which are extrinsic to what they're doing at the time, which means that for some reason, reproduction won't occur. But that doesn't mean that the sexual act doesn't occur. It means that other things surrounding the sexual act have come into play so that the normal effect of the sexual act hasn't occurred. That doesn't just happen for infertile couples. That happens for fertile couples as well, because not every act of sexual intercourse brings about reproduction. All sorts of circumstances extrinsic to the act itself come into play, which means that reproduction won't occur, that you just haven't got that right time for reproduction to occur. So there can be all these different external circumstances which don't affect the nature of the act, but which entail that the normal consequence of the act will not occur. And that's what happens with infertility. A non-sexual example. If I go out for a run, my heart rate will normally speed up and I'll start to sweat and all sorts, okay? Now the act of running is simply putting one foot in front of the other in a quick sort of motion, faster, than a walking pace. That's what the act of running is. So long as I'm doing that, I am running. Now if my heart rate doesn't increase, and if I don't sweat, that could be because there are circumstances extrinsic to my act of running, which means my heart rate isn't increasing and I'm not sweating. It could be very cold. I could be very fit, and my heart rate hasn't started going up yet because I'm very fit and, running doesn't take it out of me. So the normal consequences of the act of running haven't occurred because of certain extrinsic circumstances, but the actual act itself has occurred. So within fertile couples then, the act itself does occur, but circumstances extrinsic to the act mean that its normal consequences don't occur. It is different with regard to contraception. Contraception is not the same as infertility. When you introduce artificial contraception into the mix, into the sexual act, you're transforming the very intrinsic nature of the sexual act. Contraception is not an extrinsic factor which affects the nature of the sexual act. It seeks to change the whole sexual act itself. It literally seeks to stop the sexual act in its tracks if it's a barrier method, or indeed if it's sterilization, or it seeks to reprogram the human body in some way, particularly with regard to the sexual act by the use of the hormonal pill, so that reproduction doesn't occur. So it's not the case that there are various health conditions within the body which means that reproduction doesn't occur, as is in the case of infertility. It means that there's something intrinsic to the very act itself, which means that reproduction isn't occurring. So the introduction of artificial contraception is not like the infertility case. In the infertility case, you still have the married sexual act whereby the two are giving themselves to each other completely, but because of certain circumstances, that doesn't happen. With contraception, the two are not giving themselves to each other completely. They're withholding something of themselves from each other in order to gain some sort of sexual pleasure or something like that. So, infertile couples can enjoy the fullness of married love within the vision of Humanae Vitae, but the use of artificial contraception disrupts married love in some sort of way for the reason that we've seen. So they're not comparable scenarios. And similar sort of reasoning there applies whenever we consider the discussions for same-sex marriage, but we're not considering that this evening. Okay, that would take me, a longer sort of time. All right, the principle of totality. Okay, this was one of the major ethical principles that, the Pope was facing. Okay, so if you'll remember, this principle of totality, which was pressing itself in Paul VI, was that, look, if in the majority of sexual encounters within a marriage, if the majority of those are legitimate, i.e. they're unitive and procreative, so non-contraceptive, then in those situations which we do use contraception, they're okay, because the totality of the marriage has been one which has been unitive and procreative, and thus on the whole, the marriage is one which is unitive and procreative, and so we're good. It's okay to use contraception in a few cases or a few instances, at least in the minority. Pope Paul VI addresses this in Note 14. It's about that long, Note 14's whole page. And he introduces it this way. Neither is it valid to argue, as a justification for sexual intercourse which is deliberately contraceptive, that such intercourse would merge with the normal relations of past and future to form one single entity so as to be qualified by exactly the same moral goodness as these. That's the principle of totality. If we think of the past and the future, okay, engagements, and we see that the majority of them are good, then the whole is taken to be good. So, Pope Paul VI is going to answer this. He's going to address it. Okay, let's see how he does it. Now, the reason why the Pope holds that the principle of totality doesn't follow or doesn't apply here is that whilst you can tolerate a lesser moral evil in order to avoid a greater one, say if we pursue some sort of good course of action and as an unintended consequence of that course of action something bad happens, that's tolerating, a lesser moral evil, but it's not directly willing that moral evil. So you can tolerate that in order to produce some sort of good, okay, that you intend. One cannot actively seek to pursue something which is morally wrong, whether slight or great, so the good may come of it. Okay? Whilst you can pursue something which is good, and as a consequence, something bad may happen, which bad thing you don't intend, you can never directly intend to will something which is morally evil in and of itself. So I'll give you an example. This is known as the principle of double effect. Okay? I know we have some legal minds in the room, but I'll try not to incriminate myself. My son, okay, he's wonderful. His name's Dominic. He's 7 years old. He's got autism. And sometimes it's hard to, get him to obey instructions some sort of time. And some sort of times, he just kind of, he's in his own world and he can do his own thing. We're walking down the street, okay? So we're walking after school, trying to, get home. And Dominic, just out of nowhere, runs onto the road, okay? And if you're from West Belfast and you know West Belfast drivers, they can't drive, okay? They don't obey speed limits, all right? And so this car coming flying along in a residential area, Dominic's running straight forward, okay? Quick decision, I just, knock him out of the way. He hits the ground and falls, okay? Now, arguably I've saved his life, okay? And I hope I haven't incriminated myself by doing that. I had to knock him out of the way. Life is saved. Car goes flying on at some speed, didn't even notice. Dominic's on the ground. He's crying. For all intents and purposes, I've hit my son. I've knocked him down. But what was I doing? What was my intention in that action? I was intending to save my son's life, okay? And I took measures to save my son's life. So that is a good thing to do. It had the unintended, maybe foreseeable, but certainly unintended consequence that I hit my son and it knocked him to the ground. But that's not what I was striving to achieve. I was not striving to achieve just to hit him and knock him to the ground. If he was just standing there and he wasn't running towards the car and I just hit him, well, that would be a bad thing, okay? To intend to do that, that would be a terrible thing, okay? That would be abuse. But given that he was about to run in front of a car and I just knocked him out of the way, what I was trying to achieve was something good, and it had a bad sort of consequence that he hit the ground and was hurt. He got ice cream and he was spoiled afterwards and everything, but that's double effect. The same action can have an extra sort of effect to it that you don't intend but is a consequence of your action. Very important in the issue over abortion, okay, and the treatment of women in certain life or death situations in a pregnancy. Okay, very, very important moral principle overall. This is something that the Pope is referring to here, that you can tolerate a lesser moral evil in order to avoid a greater one. So I pursued a good sort of action so that my son didn't run in front of the car and die. And some sort of, moral evil came about as a result of that. That is, he fell and hurt himself. But I wasn't directly willing that. But you can't actively seek to pursue something which is morally wrong. I can't actively seek to, say, hit Dominic and knock him to the ground. That would be a wrong thing to do. Even if a good may come about from it. This goes right back to St. Paul, but it also goes back to the moral philosophers as well. If something is a moral evil, you cannot by direct intention will it without incurring some sort of a responsibility for willing a moral evil yourself. So you can't directly will what's positively against the moral good, since that would be to will a moral evil. Now we've seen, according to the reasoning of Humanae Vitae, that artificial contraception, it disrupts the unity of the marriage act and it changes its procreative function, and these are both morally evil and wrong things to do. So directly to will to do that in any situation is something that one ought not to do, given that they are moral evils. So to directly will a moral evil is something that one ought not to do in any situation, regardless of how many goods you think will come of it, and regardless of how many other times you will what is morally good. One can never, in any situation, directly will a moral evil. So the principle of totality cannot apply here. We have to evaluate each and every marriage act as to whether or not we're willing what's morally right or morally wrong in that act. And that's Pope Paul VI's response to the principle of totality. Okay, kind of condensed down a little bit in note 14 there. Now, what are these legitimate forms of responsible parenthood? So, we affirm the principle of responsible parenthood. Pope Paul VI affirms that. But we've rejected artificial contraception as a way of exercising responsible parenthood. So where do we go from here? So the standard method of regulating births, which was, wasn't completely known at the time that the encyclical was written, but it's better known now. This is the natural family planning method, and it focuses on having sexual intercourse during periods of infertility during the month. Now, I'm not going to go into natural family planning and, the different methods and all of that. Okay, sometimes it's quite eye-opening, that stuff. But I do have some good book recommendations, if you would like to ask me for them. I do know some of them. What I do want to bring up is an issue, a challenge which has been made to natural family planning here. And one of the challenges is that, well, look, if natural family planning is being used for responsible parenthood, is that not contraceptive? Does that not betray a contraceptive mentality? You're trying to frustrate the natural function of the sexual act. So this is why I bring up natural family planning here. But the standard natural family planning method is that the couple, they refrain from having sexual intercourse on, I think it's the 3 days or so in which the woman is fertile, and they have sexual intercourse on all the other days of the month in which the woman is infertile. And there's all these different methods of measuring that. And the objection to this is that surely that's a contraceptive mentality. That's a form of contraceptive intercourse. It may not be artificial contraception, but it's still contraceptive. It's contraception. It goes against conception, and it tries to prevent conception, tries to stop it. Shouldn't that be condemned by the Pope's own reasoning? Shouldn't Humanae Vitae stand against natural family planning? And I've seen this objection. Okay, I've come across this objection a number of times. So, we're going to consider that. Artificial contraception, it takes a natural function of sexual intercourse and it renders it obsolete. That's what it does. That's what it's designed to do. So it introduces something into the sexual act by which that act is rendered infertile. Now, in the natural family planning case, you're not adding anything to the sexual act. You're not introducing anything. You're not putting something in there to render it obsolete. So you're not introducing a barrier, sterilization, or some sort of hormone to stop reproduction taking place. Infertility is just a certain fact of human biology at certain times of the month anyway. Engaging in sexual intercourse at those times of the month is just like engaging at sexual intercourse at other times of the month. The act itself remains the same. What you're doing throughout remains the same. You're not introducing anything to disrupt the unity there. You're not changing the nature of a healthy act itself. Whereas contraceptive sexual intercourse does introduce something into the act, something intrinsic into the act, and tries to reprogram the very act itself, either through a barrier or through hormones. Whereas natural family planning doesn't do that. So the act itself remains the same, and it just occurs at different times. But it's not actually doing something to prevent conception, because you're still involved in the very act by which conception can occur. But circumstances extrinsic to the act mean that conception won't occur. So when couples engage in sexual intercourse only during their fertile times, they're engaging in that same action by which they engage at other fertile times. So when they use this method, they simply don't have sex during the fertile periods. Hence, they have sex during the infertile times. Or, and I've seen this use of natural family planning as well, if a couple want to get pregnant, they focus on having sex during the fertile times, and they lay off having sex during the infertile times, or at least, there's not as much preponderance there. So, whilst natural family planning and artificial contraception have the same outcome, okay, a lack of pregnancy or a lack of conception, there are different actions in which one engages. One is a legitimate action, i.e. marriage sexual intercourse, and the other one is an illegitimate action, contraceptive sexual intercourse, which changes the nature of the act. So the use of artificial contraception, that breaks the unity and the procreative function of the sexual act. Natural family planning does not. So natural family planning doesn't suffer from the same moral drawbacks as the artificial contraception, and so it's a legitimate method for responsible parenthood. That's the Pope's vision in Humanae Vitae. Okay, that's what I have for you this evening. That's the argumentation of Humanae Vitae. Having heard that, hopefully, you know, maybe you'll go back to the encyclical, you know, and have a read of it if you haven't read it already, but that's what's going on in the encyclical. So that's what I have for you this evening. Then in the next session, not next week, but the week after, we will look at the whole vision of marriage and the family and the foundations of this whole reasoning in Humanae Vitae. So thanks very much for coming along anyway and listening to that, and I'm free to take questions.